Welcome back to Conduct Detrimental, the first episode of 2023. Dan Lust with you, with Dan Wallach, and our guest this week, Gregg Clifton, a return guest of the show. Gregg, welcome back.
Pleasure to be back. Nice to join both of you.
Dan Wallach, how was your New Year's?
A lot of caviar and vodka were consumed, but all in all, it was no hangover. Everything's in working order, so ready to get back into the swing of things in sports law this year. How was your New Year, Dan?
It was good. Good. Some R&R with the kids who went to the beach. Lots of fun. Dan, this what I'm about to say does not apply to you since you run your own law firm, but applies to Gregg and I. January 1st is a good time of the year for many reasons. It is not for the billable attorneys because we start back at square zero. Time to bill those hours. So that's all good. Gregg, you've been on the show since you joined your new firm. You're at Lewis Brisbois. I know you're splitting time between Arizona and Boston. You have a tremendous sports practice over there. And, you and I are on the phone every once in a while talking about college sports cases, some pro cases. So we had a docket today that kind of spanned a little bit of college, a little bit of pros, and a little bit of baseball. So Gregg, with your history, we thought you'd be a great one to come on.
I appreciate it.
So here's the rough docket for today. We'll just keep this conversational. We'll see where it goes. The biggest story in sports right now is one that Dan and I were trying to hold back this episode to see if we get an update. But, as we're recording this late on Wednesday, maybe early Thursday morning, we have no update yet on the Damar Hamlin episode. Really what happened on Monday, that's really where we're at. But we're here to talk about, it's a legal podcast. So sometimes we talk about the bad, sometimes we talk about the good. So we're going to talk about the NFL safety measures that happened in that moment, some maybe sports precedent that we can look back to in other sports. This is, again, we're trying to figure out some liability issues, risk management issues. The fact that the NFL was able to do what they did in that moment, it speaks to a little bit of precedent that occurred. So we'll talk about Damar Hamlin. We'll talk about the recent release of the NCAA Transformation Committee report and recommendations. We'll talk about that, maybe the impact on the NIL era or some spoilers, lack thereof. Carlos Correa, last time we were on this podcast in 2023, Dan and I were talking about how he almost signed with the Giants, then it was the Mets, and now it's nobody. So we'll talk a little bit Carlos Correa. Gregg, you have some good stories, some more stories back in the day in baseball. And then two stories kind of in the same, right? We'll call them domestic violence incidents. One that recently happened with Dana White and one that happened with Gregg Berhalter 30 years ago, a little bit of World Cup blackmail. Interesting story. We'll get into it. Okay, so let's start with Damar Hamlin. Dan Wallach, I'm going to give you the floor. I was watching the game live. I saw it happen. Dan, your kind of thoughts when you saw the video firsthand, take us through your point of view there.
Well, I always look at it from, going back to the CBA and how the players may not have gotten the best deal for themselves. And it underscores that these are gladiators who put their, not only their careers on the line every game they play, but they place their lives on the line. And I was a little surprised to find out that a player in his position doesn't even qualify right now for, the vested retirement benefits. And should he need health insurance, were he to qualify, it only lasts 5 years after his career ends. So, it just reminds me of, how bad of a deal the players struck for themselves going back to that last CBA. And we're talking about a league full of billionaires. I want to commend the league too for how they handled this emergency response. But I always think about how underprotected the players are should these circumstances happen and they can't ply their trade anymore. What happens to a player like Hamlin? Should he not be able to play football? And I know the Bills will probably take care of him. He'll be on injured reserve until he vests those benefits. But it's really scary to think that your entire life could change in an instant when you're playing the sport of professional football. You and I and Gregg don't incur that kind of risk when we practice law, but the players could have their entire lives altered in one play, and that's what might have happened here.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's one of the things that's so scary about playing in the NFL is exactly that. And I've read several articles over the last day talking about, kind of an assumption of the risk concept where these guys know what they're getting into and the reward, the financial rewards, they are willing to take the risk. But I think the one thing that you just touched on briefly, Daniel, that really amazed me was, again, the response and what the NFL does to give the league some kudos in terms of what they have at every stadium for every game. They probably have as much as any emergency room in any hospital has available right there at the field. Irregardless of what the emergency is, they are prepared to deal with it. And I think we saw it the other night, how quickly the response was, and more importantly, how quickly the response was from informed people. They knew exactly what to do and they knew exactly what was going on, which probably ended up saving his life, considering how quickly they responded.
I think this is a good point here. We talked about it briefly on the podcast. And I know, Dan, Greg, you're both familiar with what happened with Grant Wall, the journalist who passed away over in Qatar during the World Cup. The allegation there, and we'll see if there's some litigation that pops up as a result of it. But the allegation, at least read the rumor mill, that there was no defibrillator within close proximity at the press box, and that may or may not have contributed to his passing. I know in my personal practice, I've had a case like that, not relating to a sports individual, but someone that was poolside, and there wasn't a defibrillator that was close by, and that may or may not have contributed to their passing. We are not having that conversation today because of the world-class procedures that the NFL had in place. And I think that's worth mentioning. Greg, you mentioned, right, again, until we hear it directly from the horse's mouth, you're not going to confirm or deny anything, but there are reports that, there were 9 minutes that went by without a heartbeat, that essentially that heartbeat was brought back after 9 minutes. That's why it kept going to commercials. The players were all circled around. I want to commend the NFL and the broadcast for one thing in particular. Early this year, we saw, with the Tua incident, we saw this ugly scene with the Tua being zoomed in on his hands, kind of making that crazy motion. With respect to Hamlin, you saw that one video, the one replay of what seemed to be a normal tackle on Tee Higgins, and he stands up, and then he falls back down. After that, they were very quick to kind of surround the situation, all the players, all the camera angles. Nothing really got us anything that we didn't need to see. I bring this up, and Greg, a story that you put on my radar actually yesterday when we were talking offline. Chris Pronger, a very famous NHL player, not that long ago, in the past couple decades, was hit in the heart with the puck. And the NHL coverage, I was looking up the videos on YouTube. They did a very close zoom in on Chris Pronger's kind of eyes kind of rolling back to his head. And I'm like, just not something we need to see. So credit to not just the NFL, the broadcast partners. It's a game that everyone was watching. That's a game I know a lot of my friends, a lot of my fantasy leagues, that was the last game of the season. So a lot of eyeballs were on that game, especially with the playoff ramifications. And we'll talk about the scheduling stuff. Obviously, the most important part of the story is the Hamlin stuff, but got to give credit where credit's due to the NFL. Our podcast is called Conduct Detrimental. Usually we're talking about what the NFL does wrong. A lot of things were done right in that moment.
You're 100% right. And I think that's been acknowledged by his family, by his marketing agent, and I assume by his regular agent. We haven't heard from him yet, of course, because he's still in the recovery mode. But everything I keep hearing is that he seems to be progressing in a positive way, which is wonderful for everyone to hear. And now we just keep our thoughts and prayers with him that he continues to improve.
Yeah, Greg, what can the NFL learn from this? Because, while we're commending the NFL for its actions and, speed in responding to the emergency, I think maybe more could be done. They have this emergency plan. Every team has to have an emergency plan, which they, submit to the league in advance of the season. Do you think this might lead to more regular, I don't know whether it's called training, or have more week-to-week practice, or just simulations to address an event like this happening in real time? Maybe you can narrow or reduce the response time if you have more training and drilling to prepare for a contingency like this on a regular basis.
Yeah, this reminds me of about, I guess, maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when there was a tight end on the Detroit Lions. I'm trying to remember his name. I think his name was Hughes, who actually had a heart attack on the field and died. They weren't able to revive him. And obviously techniques of reviving someone who has a heart attack back then were a lot different than they are today. Certainly, I think more practice, the better. Obviously, recognition, I think, is the crucial factor here. Whether or not they realized he was having a cardiac event is a clear question that you have to assume that somebody recognized it, because once he passed out, for lack of a better term, and fell to the ground, if you look at the one video, there is no movement. He is just laying there still, the little bit of the video that I saw. So I think you're right. There's nothing wrong with more productive simulation to make everyone aware and be responsive as quickly as possible. But again, I do think they responded pretty quickly. I know it seems like 9 minutes is a long time, but to get those people on the field and recognize the issue, and then they began the CPR almost instantly once they got on the field because they recognized what the problems were, I think is a commendable response time. But again, Daniel, I think you're right. There's never enough simulations that you can do to prepare you for a situation, even if it only happens once a decade. That's once too many.
Greg, Charles Hughes is the player you're talking about. It's the only player to pass away during games. People can look up that incident. Obviously, very tragic. We were talking offline about an incident that happened at a hockey game at Columbus Blue Jackets game 20 years ago with a fan getting hit in the face with a puck, the only fan to die during a related incident like that. Talk about Kevin Everett, the Buffalo Bills tight end who, was paralyzed during I think it was a kick return. It's sad that this stuff happens, right? And Greg, you mentioned a term just in passing. This is the first, I don't think any of the three of us have made any type of public comments on the Hamlin stuff, but a lot of people in my replies are asking, is there any liability? Can Hamlin sue the NFL? The sad reality is that this is this assumption of the risk. We can have the same conversation on the concussion angle, But I think every player that signs up to play football understands that there's some level of risk, right? People talk about going, these terms like going to war and giving it your all. And then every once in a while you have an incident like this that just really stops the NFL in its tracks. So here's where, we want to talk about the important stuff. The important stuff is Hamlin's, his life and his safety and his recovery. The other part of this, because the NFL is a business, you can't have this conversation without having the other end of it. The NFL world doesn't seem to be stopping. There were maybe some indications that this week's games could have been canceled, and they could have done what they did back in 9/11. People will recall, and I remember it. I was, fairly young at the time, but I remember they canceled all football games that weekend. And what they did is they ended up moving the playoffs back. So the way that the playoffs are set up, which many people I'm sure know, there is generally a bye week for actual gameplay. Now they put the Pro Bowl in the middle. But what they did during that 9/11 season, because they wanted to cancel all games in remembrance of what happened on that day, they basically used up that bye week. They moved the playoffs back. So there was no bye week between the conference championship game and the Super Bowl. So the NFL here has chosen not to do that. The only real update we have on the schedule, at least as of this recording, is that there will be no Bengals-Bills game played this week, which I don't know when they were going to play it. I don't know if they were trying to play it on Thursday. Where that leaves us, I truthfully think if this was the Houston Texans versus the Carolina Panthers, two teams that were eliminated, game would have been called off by now. The problem from a scheduling standpoint, the Bills were in the driver's seat for home field advantage. The Bengals, if they beat the Bills that game, they would have clinched the division. And the Chiefs are sitting out here, kind of hoping this game doesn't get made up. So a lot of playoff ramifications. And even unless there's, I think, maybe one scenario where if the Chiefs win, the Bills win, and the Bengals win, that this game doesn't necessarily need to be played. But, I think the NFL is rooting for it. But assuming that doesn't happen, I'm not sure how they're going to fit this game in. I'm not sure if they're going to call it a tie, if they're going to call it off. So, Dan, Greg, your thoughts on how the NFL deals with the scheduling issue, one that we really haven't seen since maybe the COVID stuff a couple of years ago.
I think this is why Commissioner Goodell gets paid the money he gets paid. He has the authority here, the power, the autonomy to make these decisions. And obviously he's commiserating and having conversations with the Players Association as well. I don't think there's any easy answer to this. What you said about 9/11 is obviously true. I go back to, as we talked about the other day, when President Kennedy was shot and killed and assassinated, they did not cancel the games that weekend. I know that a lot of people say that was one of the NFL's biggest mistakes, but the bottom line is they didn't. So here, I think we're moving ahead with the final week of the season. And I think my gut tells me, as you just kind of described, Dan, is they're going to wait and see how this plays out this weekend. And perhaps it ends up being moot. And if it ends up being a moot point based upon the performances of those teams this weekend, then they probably won't make it up. If it has become a relevant game, the question then becomes, when do they play it and how does it impact the remainder of the schedule, meaning the playoffs, and do they move things back and eliminate that bye week before the Super Bowl? Those will be the key decisions that have to be made. And of course, from the team's perspective, obviously they want to make sure their current players have enough rest. Both of these teams are definitely considered somewhat favorites to go pretty far in the playoffs. They certainly don't want to put them at risk of injury, not only to mention what happened with Damar, but what could happen with any of their players on short rest, especially at this point in the season.
Yeah, these are all great points. And I think if it ends up not being moot, the answer is easy. I could make that decision for a lot less money than what Roger Goodell gets paid. You have the flexibility of the bye week before the Super Bowl. So it comes down to a question of what's more of a priority, maintaining the competitive integrity and fairness and equity with the teams, or the sacrosanct bye week, which really is probably too much time between the conference championship and the Super Bowl. You've had Super Bowls played in the past where you've had no bye week. And I think I recall the New York Giants, Buffalo Bills Super Bowl in 91 was played without an intervening bye week. So it's really not that big of a deal to push all the playoff rounds back 1 week, use up the bye week, and have a result that is fair to all the teams involved without putting any of the players at any greater health risk, which you could potentially be doing if you sideline, the Bills and the Bengals players for a little bit longer, because now they're going to have potentially either of those teams can have, several weeks off around the final week of the regular season. So I think the bye week is the answer if you need it. It's there.
I agree.
Okay, I mean, we'll see what they do probably by the time this episode. Well, actually, I don't know about that. They'll probably wait until the games are over to make a decision. So.
Yeah, I think they'll wait till this weekend's over.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So, before we close this out, obviously our thoughts and prayers are with Damar Hamlin and his family. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that Damar Hamlin's charity has gone from about a $25,000 worth of donations to just over think 6 million last I checked. So a lot of
toys for kids.
Whether it's Bills Mafia or if it's just NFL fans showing their support, it's a silver lining to what otherwise is a really tragic story. So see what happens. But yeah, obviously we'll keep
them in our thoughts and prayers. That's for sure.
Okay, so let's move over. There's no easy transition to do this, but last year the NCAA at the convention, they announced they were putting together this transformation committee, and this committee's purpose was going to try to bring the NCAA, up to speed in a modern day world of sports. And I think at the time, right, we were at the heart of the NIL era. It was 2021. We were trying to figure out what exactly was going to happen. And, I think the hope was that this transformation committee was going to fix a lot of NIL problems. So without getting into all of it, Gregg, you spent a lot of time in the college sports space. I know, without getting into it, I have a feeling you have some college case on your docket tomorrow. But Gregg, I know you kind of went through the transformation committee's recommendations. I have some thoughts, but yeah, I mean, go ahead. What are your early thoughts of reading this?
I think the major initial reaction I have is that once again, the NCAA is reaching out and attempting to have as much, I guess, interaction, I'll use that word, or contribution from the student athletes. A lot of what's mentioned in that report, which of course is being submitted to the board of directors, talks about getting more student athletes involved in the process, getting their input, getting their thoughts. Not to mention some of the recommendations already. The one that jumps off the page very quickly is the potential expansion of the NCAA tournament and any other tournaments or championship level competitions, which could grow ultimately to 90 games, 90 teams rather participating, which would be an amazing level of contribution. But the one thing that I haven't heard anybody talking about, unless the revenue streams are expanded, those 90 teams now are going to be splitting up the same amount of money that's currently being shared by 68 teams. So the impact will be very interesting, especially for some of the mid-majors who I don't think are going to get more opportunities. I think this is going to be more opportunities for the Power Fives to have, instead of 3 or 4 teams, they might have 5 or 6 teams that get involved in an expanded NCAA tournament. The other interesting thing that I thought, which you touched on or foreshadowed with, Dan, is the whole NIL issue. We've been hearing about student athlete rights. And again, if anyone wants to review the report, they'll see everything. Really, a major focus of the report is talking about student athletes, their involvement, expansion of health insurance for any players who are injured during their career for 2 years, a 10-year period of time for a student athlete to complete their degree, a lot of medical requirements or suggestions at this point, where, again, we're talking about injuries on the field, where schools are going to be responsible for having a training staff member, and they list about 12 or 14 different sports at every one of their practices, as well as every one of their activities. When you look and see some of those sports are going to be 3 or 4 sports from the same period of time in the same season, the cost that'll be that inherent for the colleges to be able to go out and find and hire trainers to be available is going to be interesting. But again, aimed at protecting the student athlete and growing the student athlete voice in this whole process. So it's interesting that's the angle that was used. But the NIL, again, was really put to the side. It's mentioned, I believe, one time in the whole 40-page report, where it talks about the need that they don't believe they have the authority unilaterally to make any of these NIL decisions, and the need for congressional intervention. And that's one of the interesting things about who they've selected to be the new head of the NCAA. Charlie Baker is a friend I know for a long time, an expert when it comes to bipartisan involvement. He's done it for 8 years in a Democratic state as a Republican governor in Massachusetts. And I think he's exactly what the NCAA needs. Because, again, they need someone who's got the ability to go down to Washington and convince some of these legislators to be more bipartisan, as opposed to so partisan as they've been over the last year and a half with the proposed legislation. So it'll be an interesting process over the next 6 months to a year, that's for sure.
I guess let's do it here. I mean, there's a quote in the report that, I think you and I both kind of picked up. Quote, "There's no question that finding fair, sustainable, and equitable resolutions to each issue will be essential to Division I's future. We simply need a clear, stable framework under which to address them. Congress is the only entity that can grant that stability." So I might disagree with that. That seems to be, we're talking a little bit of football here, right? That seems to be punting to someone else that's not them. You put this committee together for months, and I read it. I mean, Greg Sankey's there. You have some heavy hitters on the panel. Greg Sankey, SEC commissioner, maybe the most powerful man in all of college sports. Weekly meetings over the course of the last year. That's 52 sessions these guys put together. And that's all they come up with. That, hey, let's kick it down to Congress. I'm not sure that's going to make anyone happy. But again, these are certainly recommendations. Again, I think we try to be fair on this show. We try to talk about the things that they do right, the things they do wrong. One of the recommendations that no one's going to give them credit for, at least with respect to this release, is staggering the transfer portal, which I think they should get credit for. I'm not sure how long ago that this recommendation came, but this was a byproduct of this transformation committee's meetings way back when. So yeah, I think it was complete chaos. And Gregg, I know you speak to your fair share of ADs, at least my conversations with those on the college side was that it was almost an immeasurable task if all of your athletes were entering the transfer portal at the same time. At least if you're dealing with your spring sports and your fall sports and your winter sports, at least you can kind of put out fires, as they come up. Everything is important, but some things have to be urgent. And if you're dealing with all the problems at the same time, from the Power 5 schools to the Group of 5 schools entering the transfer portal at the same time, that's an issue. So we can give the transformation, those guys some credit for at least flagging that. But yeah, I think it leaves, at least what we're coming out here, the new stuff, we'll say, I think it leaves a lot to be desired.
To me, the interesting point, Dan, in addition to everything we just talked about with the Transformation Committee, there's still a very strong push right now, led by the General Counsel of the Labor Board, Ms. Abruzzo, who's moving forward with a complaint at this juncture. There'll be a hearing before the NLRB, which could potentially have these student athletes be classified as employees under the NLRA. What's interesting is, despite her pushing, we don't have one student athlete, not one, who stepped forward in any way, shape, or form to file an unfair labor practice, do anything to sort of pull in the quote-unquote methodologies, I guess I'll call it, of the NLRB. They weren't interested. They're not interested in unionizing, I don't believe, because no one has done it since the Northwestern football team. The question you might ask yourself is why? And I think the answer to that question is very simple. We have NIL now. I don't need a union. I don't need to be paying someone union dues. I don't need to be dealing with the rules and the regulations of being a union member. I'm very fortunate. I have NIL rights, and I can go out and sell my marketing rights and benefit from that while I'm an undergraduate and playing sports. So that's an interesting push. And then, of course, there's the lawsuit in Philadelphia, which is still probably another year or so away from really coming into the middle of things, which is where they're trying to have student athletes declared employees under the FLSA or the Fair Labor Standards Act, or as a lot of people call it, the overtime law. So the bottom line is the NLRB is going to happen sooner. It probably won't be at least a year until all the appeals are played out. But it's important, I think, to note that these are all happening simultaneously while this transformation committee is issuing this report and is going to be trying to present this to the board of directors next week. And some of these expansion issues, again, playing down, having more authority for student athletes, getting more roles for conferences and schools is really not going to really kick in until probably 2025 when it comes to the NCAA tournament, if in fact it's expanded as it's being suggested.
I think it's a great point. I'm happy you brought up Abruzzo. I will say one more thing as we close up our NCAA side. Sean Clifford, the quarterback for Penn State, made some headlines in July of this past year for potentially, maybe reportedly, rumors, whatever, potentially trying to mobilize Penn State to unionize. And there was that kind of media scrum where he kind of had to walk it back. Then he had to meet with Kevin Warren. So, Gregg, to your point, why has a player not stepped up? Clifford seemed to, kind of step back in line once, Penn State and the Big Ten perked up. And NIL money, right, is seemingly dependent on playing time and exposure. So surprised, Clifford's a pretty, noteworthy guy with a big program. I'm surprised no one at a lower level has. So, we'll see.
Yeah, and one thing I'm surprised by, Dan, in fact, even if it's not trying to unionize, the way it was laid out, they certainly could have, let's say, a coach did some type of a punitive action against a player in terms of punishment. There's certain other things under the National Labor Relations Act called, activities where basically group activities are protected under the law. And the bottom line is, if there would have been some punishment, let's say running lines or some ridiculous punishment, running the bleachers when it was 100 degrees in summer practice, these players could have filed an unfair labor practice charge, and they would have been certainly greeted and welcomed by Abruzzo, which would not have been unionization, but it still is something I think she was hoping to get to give her a little bit more clout. Right now, they only have 2 charges that have been filed. One has gone to a complaint, which is the case involving a USC. So we'll see where that ends up in terms of how the administrative law judges rule on that. And there's a joint employer issue there, too, where they're trying to establish that both the Pac-12 as well as the NCAA are joint employers of these student athletes, as well as USC.
See, Gregg, this is why we have you on the podcast, because you're just a wealth of information. So we go from pro football, college football, and Gregg, this is, as I set you up a little bit here. Gregg, the reason I know you, and the reason I think most of our listeners will know you, is from your history in the baseball world. Dan Wallach, I'll give it to you. Carlos Correa was about to be a member of my San Francisco Giants, and was about to be a member of the New York Metropolitans, Dan, your former team. Now he remains a free agent. So Dan, I'll give it to you for the latest on this one.
Yeah, did you say my former team? It's true. I changed allegiances. I went from the Mets to the Yankees during the craziness of the mid 70s when the Mets were just run into the ground by Linda DeRoulette and M. Donald Grant. I became a Yankees fan. I also switched allegiances, became an Islanders fan for 1 week in 1975. But anyway, dialing it back, bringing it back to the current situation, we're talking about Carlos Correa, and you've been an agent for David Wells and many other prominent players in Major League Baseball. Have you ever heard of a deal like this being almost announced or leaked to the press, and then two different organizations getting cold feet and raising an issue about an injury that occurred years earlier that hasn't seemed to have impeded the player's career? And we're talking about a 2014 ankle injury and surgery to repair a fractured right tibula that is over 8 years in the past and hasn't caused the player to miss any games. What went wrong here?
What we're seeing here, you saw today the Red Sox big deal for over $300 million. As these numbers have just, incredibly grown contract-wise in terms of guaranteed years of length, 10, 11 seasons, not to mention guaranteed amounts of money, I think there is a certain concern of making sure, not necessarily on a performance basis, but they want to make sure that the players are going to be, at least at this junction when they execute these contracts, healthy as they enter into these agreements. All these agreements, the way the process works is you negotiate a contract, and then there's what we call a term sheet, which is just essentially a one-page summary of the terms that have been agreed to. But all of these contracts of this duration involve physicals, because most of these teams will go out, it might be very expensive, but they go out and they seek some type of disability insurance coverage to try and offset some of these astronomical dollars that they're paying to these players right now. So what we're seeing here is obviously the physicians, orthopedics, the experts, the specialists who are reviewing these documents and these physicals from prior years. And obviously, I believe they thought he was hurt this year when he slid into second base one time with the Twins. They're assessing the risk and they're reporting back and they're saying, you know what? We are concerned, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming they're reporting back and saying we are concerned about the potential risk of this young athlete being able to play out the duration of this contract. And they're letting the teams know this. You asked about other ones. I can remember a time several years ago when Peter Angelos was the owner of the Baltimore Orioles and still is. And he had a player that he signed and he failed him on his physical, and they basically did not honor the contract that had been agreed to at a time when the dollars were not the way they are now. And there was a lot of flack given about it, but the bottom line is the way those physicals work typically is the team has 100% autonomous control over the physical. And obviously over the years, I had issues with David Wells, who had multiple back surgeries and knee surgery, and he had Tommy John before it was called Tommy John surgery on his elbow. And we always had to deal with that issue and that concern of whether or not he would be able to pass a physical, especially with his back. And there was a couple of occasions, one at age 41 when we signed him with the Red Sox for a 2-year guaranteed contract, that we were very fortunate that the surgeon who had repaired his back, the reports came back and he was fine. But again, that's what the issue we have here is, I think, is the amount, the gross dollars of the guarantee. And now the question becomes, how do the Mets and how does Scott Boras attempt to, I guess, just modify it in some way, shape, or form to provide the Mets some of the protection they're seeking, but at the same point protect Scott Boras and his representation of that client who's agreed to this large contract. And that's where we're at right now. And of course, over the holidays, didn't make it any easier to try and get this resolved.
As an agent, what kind of solution would you propose? Because we're talking about a risk associated with the ankle. Certainly, there could be some contract language to provide for some kind of an offset or avoiding of years directly attributable to any ankle injuries.
You're right, Daniel. The one thing, obviously, is it would have to be limited very specifically to the surgical intervention that was done with that ankle. And then the question, of course, becomes, so if he hurts his ankle and he's out for 6 months, even a season, is that something that's reverting back to the prior injury he had? Or is this a new injury that he had? We see this all the time with pitchers in particular who have Tommy John surgery and then do multi-year contracts. Most of those contracts don't contain any exclusions. There's not any specific protection that protects those contracts for the team to be able to avoid it. Now, certainly he had a situation a couple of years ago, meaning Scott Boras, who I have a great deal of respect for, with J.D. Martinez, from my understanding, is with the Red Sox when prior to him signing his 5-year contract with the Red Sox that just expired. I believe there was I don't remember what the issue was. There was some physical issue, and they worked on some type of language that acknowledged that concern and gave the Red Sox, comfort, I'll call it, from a contractual point of view to move forward with it. But keep in mind, the concern you have here is this is not a 5-year contract. This is more than double that in terms of length. And any player who's 29, I believe is what his Correa's age is, who potentially has a contract that's going to go to age 39 or 40. There's going to be some issues, but that's the risk that the team has to be willing to take. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. The concern you have to have as an agent right now, Daniel, is if this doesn't work out, where does he go? What other suitors are out there at a $300 million clip? Obviously, the Twins, I understand, offer him a $250 million contract, which is still an exorbitant amount of money, but it's not near the amount of money that the Giants offered, certainly, and that the Mets have put on the table. So it's going to be interesting to see, I hate to use the expression, to see who blinks first.
Yeah, would a shorter term be a softer landing spot?
I don't think there's any way they're going to shorten the term.
Really?
I don't think Scott Boras is going to be willing to cut that deal down from the length down to a 5-year deal. Because again, the leverage he'll have when he's 33 or 34 is certainly not the leverage he has now. So I guess the question is right now, he's still a free agent. So whether or not, knowing Scott's expertise, he's going out and having additional conversations with other teams, perhaps even the Twins as well, while this negotiation is going on with the Mets, is certainly permitted because he does not have a contract with the Mets. The Mets have now said, we're not okay with the physical. So that opens up his free agency again to go out and speak with as many teams as he wants to. Now, the question is how many teams are out there with $300 million for a player who's 29, who had a serious ankle injury 8 years ago? I don't know. That's what has to be. That's the job of an agent, what Scott does very well.
Well, hopefully a team that plays ball on River Avenue in New York might be in the running, but I think there's this détente between the Yankees and the Mets currently, where there's almost like a
that has not been proven, Daniel. No, don't make that allegation. The commissioner investigated that.
Yeah, real deep dive investigation. How long did that investigation last? 5 minutes?
I was going to say at least a little while.
Dan, we didn't record an episode in that time period between the Mets and the Giants, but I think we could have predicted, all of us being practitioners. I don't know about, I think, I don't know how much personal injury work you've done. I think, Greg, you've been around the block, at least on those type of cases. But if a doctor for the Giants says that there's a particular flag on his medicals with respect to a particular, his leg injury, right? We didn't say it at the time, but I was thinking about it in hindsight. I'm like, it would be almost impossible, almost like malpractice, if the Mets wouldn't flag that same issue. Why would the Giants find it and the Mets wouldn't find it? So I think, a lot of my Mets fans were like, oh my God, I can't believe the Mets doctor found the same thing. Like, what, did the Giants just make this up? The Giants intentionally wanted to look like, and I'm a Giants fan, Giants wanted to look stupid on purpose and, we're flagging something that didn't need to be flagged.
I think it's a risk assessment, Dan. You
right.
Hit the nail right on that. I think any good orthopedist would probably identify the same risk, which I don't know what they formally identified. Then a function becomes, okay, if Dr. X and Dr. Y both found the same risk issue, what is the risk tolerance from the team's perspective, number one? And number two, does that acknowledgement by the team doctor prevent the team from perhaps going out and being able to secure the disability insurance I was talking about? Right. When we're talking about the dollars we're talking about here, I know the Mets several years ago, if my memory is correct, had a disability policy on David Wright. And when David Wright couldn't play, there was a threshold of so many games he had to miss before it would kick in. I'm sure the Mets would potentially be seeking the same type of disability insurance. And if they were not able to, or if they were told by their insurer that would not be an insurable risk or the expense of that insurable risk, that could also lead to a conclusion that we're not willing to bear the risk based upon what our doctors have told us.
So I'm going to give you a quote. Ken Rosenthal had an article out. Obviously, not much new on the Correa landscape. Obviously, besides he's a free agent. Term in here that I had not heard before. Greg, I imagine you're familiar with it. And this is, again, to at least provide a little bit of context. Rosenthal is explaining that if they wanted to get a deal done and everyone's flagging this injury, you could put some contingencies in the deal specifically based on a leg injury. So this is a quote from Ken Rosenthal. Quote, the way to do it in a situation like this is to put something in the contract called an exclusion clause. And that basically says if a player spends X number of days on the injured list with this specific injury to that part of the leg, then you could void future years or you can lower the guarantee. There are all kinds of ways to do it.
The interesting thing about what you just said and what you just read is the exclusion itself. What are we excluding? So, for example, I'll go back to pitchers because I represented so many pitchers. So if a guy has Tommy John surgery, are you going to say if there's an issue with the ligament that was reconstructed in his elbow, what happens if he gets bone chips in that same elbow? Are we excluding the entire elbow? What happens if he gets hit by a line drive as a pitcher and he breaks his elbow and he's no longer able to pitch? How do we draft that exclusion to protect the team and protect, quote unquote, the player? Because you, as both you guys know as litigators, at the end of the day, that just smells like litigation heaven to me. Because if you don't agree on specifically what the exclusion is or how you're going to determine the exclusionary factor, I think you're setting yourself up for problems, again, which may be resolvable with an arbitration or some type of dispute resolution process. But that would be my concern is, how are we defining what the exclusion is? If it's, if it's my finger and it's because if I lose the use of my finger, okay, that's pretty clear. But when it comes to an elbow or an ankle, how are we going to define an ankle? Both joints, elbows, and ankles are very difficult to diagnose. What happens if there's some other ligament that he tears in his ankle that impacts the surgery? I mean, there's so many ways, and that's what makes it very difficult. And that's the process that I think Mr. Boras and the Mets are going to be going through right now. Because I know one thing, I don't think Scott wants to let this deal go, because I don't think he's aware of any other deals or any other suitors that might be out there at the same significant dollars. So the negotiation, if I'm the Mets, is, hey, we want to change this contract based upon what we found out. Here's what we're willing to do, whatever that is. And then Boras has to make a decision whether or not he thinks with Correa he can find alternative suitors that are as good or better than the Mets' revised or restructured proposal. And that's where I hate to say it, the game of liar's poker is going to kick in here. And that's what contract negotiations are all about. Who's going to blink first? Does Correa say, hey, if I can get $250 million, $275 million without risk, and the risk only kicks in on the amount over 250 or 275 million, hey, maybe I should take this because I'm going to bet on myself that I'll stay healthy. So it's going to be interesting to see. Ultimately, I think Ken is right. There's going to be some exclusionary type language that'll be placed in the agreement. The question becomes, how is that exclusionary language drafted, and how does it protect the player as well as protect the team?
How much culpability do the teams have here? Because the marketplace for Correa's services has really been impaired by jumping the gun, with the Giants jumping the gun, scheduling an introductory news conference. And then the Mets, in turn, their majority owner, 100% owner, Steve Cohen, gives an interview to John Heyman in the New York Post saying, hey, this deal puts us over the top. They've jumped the gun, announced the deal, and then they're getting cold feet because the medicals haven't been concluded. Do the teams bear any culpability here? Speaking about litigation heaven and the potential for a grievance here, because they've basically cut off and limited the field for his services by raising red flags when this should have been handled quietly without any news conferences.
It's interesting. That's a great question, Daniel. And I've thought about it for a lot over the years. I've had certain contracts over the years where they've been announced, and they were announced prior to the physical actually taking place, or I should say they were leaked having a deal, one of which was David Wells with the Arizona Diamondbacks. And they leaked that deal was going to get done, but the deal was subject to a physical with a orthopedic doctor that the Diamondbacks had. And this has become fairly well known and well chronicled. At the end of the day, the deal was not official, and the Yankees reached out to David directly, ironically enough, and courted him to come and re-sign with the Yankees. And this was the year after the Diamondbacks had beaten the Yankees in the World Series. So again, the physical and the hiatus between the negotiation and the agreement to terms and the finalization of an agreement is always contingent upon this physical, especially on a multi-year contract. So it's nothing that's new. The issue, which is kind of ironic, is it's usually the teams and the excitement that the teams have that get themselves in trouble because they announce the deal. They're all excited. They can't believe they got this player done. And then without waiting for the physical to take place and without waiting for the doctors to give the go-ahead, they announce the deal. So the team puts themselves in an awkward position. And unfortunately, I don't think the player really has any ramifications because it's not a deal that's confirmed. It's a deal that's reported. The terms are there, but it's subject, completely conditional upon the passing of a physical, which again is a physical that is controlled by the team. So that's the interesting angle how this takes place.
That'll do it for our main three topics. We're going to talk about one more topic before we get out. A reminder, our podcast is sponsored by Themis Bar Review. The February bar is right around the corner. If you do need help with the February bar, need some final moments of prep, or you're like, oh, why did I sign up for this other bar prep company? Listen, this is why we tell you Themis is the best bar prep company. Use our promo code CONDUCT. Get a lot of money off. We're not even going to tell you how much. Pop on the site. It'll tell you how much money, or you can just tell us. We will tell you. Reach out to us directly. We will give you all the download on Themis Bar Review.
I'm thinking about studying for the bar. I was just I'm thinking about all the people who just went through the holidays, and now it's like, oh, I got to really bear down and get this done.
I spoke to someone today who shall remain nameless. I was talking to a student who's using Themis, and they're like, oh, I have to get to the home stretch. Should I take off of work? Should I work from home? And I'm like, oh, hopefully you have a nice employer, but they should let you take 2 weeks off. Okay, actually, let's take a little bit of a detour. Greg, if you had an associate that went to you that was studying for the bar exam, and they said to you, can I have 2 weeks off before the bar? Would you say yes?
I would say yes.
I think you have to.
You know why? Because selfishly, you want that individual attorney to pass the bar.
Right.
And the ramifications of not passing the bar. Now, here's the key question, Dan. If you give them the 2 weeks off and then they don't pass the bar, that's a challenging situation. But I think everybody supports their young attorneys who are going through this process, because the interesting thing is we all went through it. And I don't think any one of us can ever say it was a fun experience, because if anybody does, I think they're lying. I had the ultimate experience because I was living in New Jersey, and back then it still exists. I think the rivalry between the bars, and I took New York and New Jersey a few days. We had to go to Albany. They wanted to take the New York portion of it and then drive back and go to New Jersey and take the multi-state the second day, and then the New Jersey part the third day. So I have lovely memories of driving back from Albany, convinced that I had just failed the New York State bar. But fortunately, I was wrong. I passed. So I was very fortunate.
We all made it to the finish line. Hopefully those that are listening and those are taking the bar soon, using us as a study break, will make it as well. Okay, let's end on this. Two stories that came across our radar in the last, week, right around there. Gregg Berhalter, coach of the United States men's national team. He's the coach of the team since 2018. Came out this week. And Dan, I'm gonna let you do a little bit of the backdrop here of some of these new allegations that came out. But I'll give you the highlights of the Berhalter stuff and the Dana White stuff, then we can break it down. Berhalter allegedly, again, we say allegedly on this stuff. Some of it's been confirmed by Berhalter himself in a statement. It's just kind of an odd story. We'll put it that way. But during the course of the World Cup, somebody came out and I guess reached out to the U.S. Soccer Federation and essentially said they have this allegation on Gregg Berhalter. It's a domestic incident from years ago. And what did Berhalter do? He kind of kept it under wraps up until this past week, where he came out with a statement and explained his version of events. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially said that there was an incident that he had with his then girlfriend outside of a bar. They had an altercation, and I think he kicked her legs, was what he said in his statement. They broke up for a period of time, they reconciled, and they've been married for 25 years since then. So that's Gregg Berhalter's version of events. I have heard through, just reading around on Twitter that might be making light of the situation. But you have that incident on the one hand. And then what happened with Dana White this past week? Dana White, the president, I think that's his title, president, CEO. He's the big guy, the head maca over at the UFC. There was an incident caught on camera. He was on vacation, and for a New Year's event, the video's out there. People can see it. And Dan Wallach, I know you have some strong thoughts on this. Dana White is caught on, someone's must have been a cell phone camera, whispering in his wife's ear about something. I'm not sure what it was. Wife turns, slaps Dana White. Dana White turns around and slaps him. Now, why this is relevant? If that was all that happened, if it was a domestic incident between husband and wife, that's pretty bad. Dana White has said in his own words, dating back, I think this was 2014, right around when the Ray Rice stuff was coming out. I read some quotes of his, essentially that there's no excuse ever for a man putting his hands on a woman, and that if it happens in the UFC, there is no excuse for it and there is no tolerance. And all of a sudden, it happens to the main guy. So, Dan, I'll let you take first crack at this. Two stories kind of happening at the same line. One is a domestic violence incident from 30 years ago. Another one just happened. But I'm not seeing much punishment as of today for either of these individuals.
I want to focus on Dana White. And Greg, I want to ask you, does this strike you as just a catastrophe, a public relations disaster for no discipline? I mean, this is a guy who runs the UFC, right? If this had happened in Roger Goodell's NFL, or forget the NFL, if this had happened in the NBA, Adam Silver, he would have been suspended, right? You have the Ray Rice episode where he assaulted his wife. Mind you, this wasn't the same level of assault as what Ray Rice inflicted on his then girlfriend in an Atlantic City elevator. But you have a recorded instance of domestic violence for the entire world to see. And it doesn't matter who started, whether she slapped him first. He's a much bigger man. And in his own words, there's never an excuse for a man to hit a woman, but he slapped her hard twice after that initial hit. Yet there's going to be no consequence inflicted upon Dana White in terms of discipline. And if it had happened in any of the team sports, you can make certain that they would have been disciplined. Aroldis Chapman from the New York Yankees, faced an expulsion from the game for hitting his wife at a public team event in New York City. So what do you think is the appropriate response here, given that it does have sponsors? There seems to be a need for some type of action. What should that action consist of?
This is a classic crisis PR issue. You had a president of the San Francisco Giants several years ago had a similar situation, and I believe he was suspended for a year. This is a situation where you have the same person who's essentially acting as the same judge and jury of himself. And I think you hit the key word on the head there a few minutes ago: sponsors. Is anyone going to react to this in any way, shape, or form, which will threaten the financial stability or the financial wherewithal of the UFC? if no one's going to react, I don't think you'll see any reaction, because from a crisis point of view, he got out there in front of it. He apologized. He says it wasn't acceptable. So he has done the mea culpa. Now, whether or not that mea culpa is sufficient or adequate, that's a decision the fan base has to make, because again, there's no collective bargaining agreement here. So it's the key decision that you have to decide.
But with some of the issues surrounding the Washington Commanders and some of the, sexual assault allegations, you see these women's advocate groups and domestic violence, groups. I don't know if that's the right term, but there's public pressure placed by some organization on these sponsors. And I haven't seen anything yet emerging from the typical voices that stand up for those who are affected by domestic violence.
And I think that'll be the key question. If and when does any of these groups stand up? Do they make any demands? Do they make any quote unquote, we have to do this, you have to react to this, or does it just kind of go by the wayside? And that's what's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And I think will be, again, really something to watch closely, because again, in a team sport, as you correctly said, which would have a group of team owners and a commissioner, I think you'd have a different response. But here, unless the board of directors or whoever the other hierarchy are within the UFC react to it, like I said a moment ago, you have the same person acting as the judge and the jury and deciding about himself.
He's too valuable to the brand of the UFC. He's the figurehead. He's the Vince McMahon. He's the ringleader.
Ironically, Vince McMahon was accused of things. And what happened to Vince? He's gone.
Well, I'd like to be gone while still owning 100% of the company. So he's not, we could debate whether he's truly gone.
Well, the stock's only at 73.
Let's put this here for a second, because there's another story we can tie in very quickly while we're trying to wrap this bad boy up. With the respect to Berhalter, and we talk a little bit about on the show about, PR and how to handle this in crisis management. I watched Dana White's interview with TMZ. What he essentially said is he had a moment, he made a mistake. His wife and him have talked about it. They're talking to their kids. They're happily married. It's the first time this thing's ever happened. And my wife is standing by me. You read Berhalter's statement that came out earlier this week. He's talking about an incident that happened 25 years ago. He said that his wife stands with him. They've moved past it. And so if you're watching the PR spin, basically saying that the person who is the quote unquote victim here, one occurred recently, one occurred 30 years ago. This person, this isn't exactly what's happening, but this person doesn't want to press charges on me. They're taking it back. No big deal.
They're not making it a bigger story than it already is.
And the other one here I want to tie in, if we can, Chris Beard, the coach at University of Texas, college basketball coach. Last time, Dan, you and I think, not sure when we covered this necessarily in the podcast, but there was an allegation of strangulation between Chris Beard and his fiance. And, within maybe a week, 10 days of that allegation, the fiance said, you know what, I'm retracting it. I overreacted. I don't want to press charges. So, if you're just trying to figure out, in the future when these things come up, watch what the spouse/victim does. That's going to give you a lot of this, what PR can.
And to answer Daniel's point about that, it's interesting what the University of Texas did. They immediately suspended him without pay. So again, there was a reaction from the employing entity when that story broke. Unlike here, the employing entity is, they're not doing anything. So that's the key question. What if any groups are going to respond to this, or is this just going to sort of go by the wayside and Dana is going to do some other PR things to apologize and to make up for this indiscretion?
Yeah, to your point, I think if this happened to an owner in the NBA, certainly Adam Silver would do something. Not sure if we've ever seen a precedent of like a version of Adam Silver doing this, like the guy on the top of the league. So that's why the Dana White one's interesting.
President of the San Francisco Giants. That's the closest thing I can think of. And I don't think there was a physical altercation. That was just, I believe, a public episode, if I remember correctly. I don't remember the whole story.
Yeah, so we'll keep an eye on it. I know Dan Wallach, you sent me an article about Stephen A. Smith coming out and saying how hypocritical it was for Dana White not to suspend himself after these allegations come out. So we'll see what happens. And we talk about this in the show a good amount. The more noise that is made, the more action that happens. So we'll see.
Absolutely.
We're not hearing any noise right now. Okay, I think we can end here. Greg, we'll give you the final word. Anything you want to add before we get out of here?
No, I just want to thank both of you for the opportunity to speak with you on all these lovely sports issues. And again, our continued thoughts and prayers to Damar as he continues to battle and recover from the horrific injury on Monday evening.
Greg, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I think this is your third time or fourth time.
I think it is.
You're a regular, but this is your first gig as sort of, co-host. You hit it out of the park, to use baseball parlance. So it was a great episode. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have you back to do this again, just to go around the horn on a whole wide variety of issues. It's always great to talk to you, Greg. Have a great start to your new year, and I'm sure we'll catch up very soon.
Thanks, guys.
Well,
Dan, Daniel, thank you both.
So a little bit of a programming note. We recorded that conversation on Wednesday night. As we did say, as of that time, we had not really heard a Damar Hamlin update. So we are recording this segment on Thursday when there has been very, very much a positive update. So before we get into that, Conlan's going to join me to close the show, as he does each and every week with the Bettor Edge betting segment. Yeah, Conlan, let's just talk about, before we get into betting and before we get into some college sports stuff, let me get your thoughts on the Damar Hamlin stuff, where we stand, and the most recent update that we're getting today on Thursday morning.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So like you said, let in with positive news out of Damar Hamlin, his situation. Kaiir Elam, fellow safety for the Buffalo Bills, tweeted this morning that Damar Hamlin has awoken. He is now improved significantly. They've also came out reports that he is neurologically intact, so all brain function seems to appear normal, which is incredible news. Obviously, a terrifying scene Monday night. And so just with that, that's really, really good news to wake up the entire NFL community this morning. Still praying for Damar Hamlin, obviously not out of the woods yet, but very, very encouraging signs for him.
Yeah, that's really good news. I think the other update, Conlan, that I saw, I don't know if this is going to come to fruition, but at least as of recording this on Thursday, still not entirely clear what the Bills are going to be doing this weekend, if they're actually going to play the Patriots or whatnot. But it's touch and go. And I guess, to some extent, the decision whether or not to continue playing that Cincinnati Bengals game was a decision made by the players, and whether or not the Bills play this weekend is going to be a decision from the players. It's not something that we've ever seen before. So it's obviously we're figuring out as we go, but can only, respect the NFL that they're at least trying to do the right thing. And there's no easy answers in this situation, but Conlan, I wanted to make sure we provided that update in light of our prior comments. Okay, so let's do this. Conlan, we didn't have you on last. You got annoyed at me. You're like, why wasn't I on the end of the...
I don't know why you're trying to hide, this content in a time where the U.S. economy is in the tanks, and I'm giving people just maybe, just peanuts, just something, a little extra, take your family out to dinner, mediocre stuff like that. And I don't know, you just decide to deprive the people, our valued listeners, our incredible conduct detrimental audience, a winner. So I will say shame on you, Dan Lust, but not shame on you because you've had me on for several weeks now. But I will say Dan did not have me on, but in our own conduct group chat where we're all wishing each other Happy New Year and stuff, I did give out the Jacksonville Jaguars -3 against the Houston Texans, which cashed easily. So I will say that's what you were all deprived of. So Dan Lust, you can find him on Twitter @SportsLawLust, so you can voice your displeasure with him there.
I can verify that happened. You also had some other choice words and some other bonus picks that did not cash, but you did have the Jacksonville picks. I'll give you that. Colin, where's your record stand as of today? What do you like?
So if we're talking just public picks alone, we'll go 11-3-1. But let's say it's not too shabby. I'll throw the Jackson one in there.
11-3-1. I'll give you credit for it. I was your witness. I'm also a notary public, so had you wrote that out, I could have stamped it.
Well, if the Jacksonville Jaguars picks included, it's 12-3-1.
I'll give you 12-3-1. No,
all right, so 12-3-1.
Can we just stop for a second and just talk about how impressive that is? Is that impressive?
Listen, I don't want to toot my own horn here, but that's cashing at a rate above 80% on the year, which is, again, anybody in sports gambling knows that you cash anywhere over the world's best cash, maybe 55 to 60%. So 80%, I don't want to say, Billy Walters here, but, who knows? Maybe someday.
Yeah, let's do this. This is a sports law podcast. We talk about sports betting stuff. Dan Wallach, I'm sure, will listen to this. He tries to figure out a way to talk about sports betting legislation in every way possible. So we do talk about law. We did not talk about the fact that Pete Rose placed the first legal bet in the state of Ohio very recently. But we gotta talk. We gotta do some business here. Okay, so each and every week we do this. It's the Bettor Edge segment with Colin Farrell. Colin, you have 12 wins on the season. You were picking bets at an incredibly high rate. I will again give you credit for last week's bet. Colin, where did I take you this week for your pick?
So we're going to go out west. We'll go to Seattle, where the Seattle Seahawks play host to the Los Angeles Rams, who obviously have been out of contention for quite some time now. But look, the last spot in the NFC is up for grabs. Sunday Night Football has flexed the Lions and Packers game, both teams sitting at 8-8. And right now, the Seattle Seahawks hold the 7th seed with an 8-8 record. So they must win to get in, because if they lose, whoever wins that Packers-Lions game then takes their spot as the last team in the NFC playoff picture. Right now on Bettor Edge, you're getting the Seattle Seahawks -6.5. Love that spot from there. Like I said, at this point, the Rams players probably making some business decisions, especially when it comes to, preventing injury on their side. So I like to see the Seattle Seahawks, who, again, killed my Jets last week and destroyed all hope for me seeing a Jets playoff team. So the Jets have not been in the playoffs since I was 13 years old. That drought continues. I'm now making it 12 consecutive years they missed the playoffs. So the Seattle Seahawks, I want to root for them -6.5 at home against the struggling Rams squad.
So, Colin, you feel pretty confident in that pick?
I do. I'll be confident in everyone.
Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of bonus pick this week. Our other sponsor on our podcast is the law firm of Orr and Horgan. Those guys are our Nebraska law firm. We usually talk about them with respect to the college sports stuff. We were on such a roll with the NCAA Transformation Committee recommendations. I probably should have thrown in a little bone there to our friends over in Nebraska. But we have the proverbial Super Bowl of college football that is occurring this upcoming week. So we got Georgia, we got TCU. Conlan, I was going to say it before when you asked me, like, oh, why didn't you want to have me on the end of the year episode, Dan? Shame on you, Dan Luss. Listen, I let a lot of those things slide. Why not, Conlan? Because I was away on vacation and I was away with my kids, and I'm like, let me bank one episode. We did the week prior, and I'm like, let me let this thing ride. The only one that I think that was like, Dan, you can't take a vacation. I have to be on this podcast.
Winners don't take a day off. That's my only retort.
I think you just called me a loser by the transition property. So yeah, I watched as the ball dropped. We had like a really fun New Year's. We're on the beach with the kids and all this good stuff on the fireworks, all this stuff. We watched the Michigan TCU stuff. I was at a hotel with like random people wearing Michigan jerseys. That certainly ruined their New Year's night, New Year's Eve. And then Ohio State, Georgia, both fantastic games. We didn't talk about it, but obviously the field goal crossing the line as the ball dropped, at least on the East Coast, was pretty sweet. So, Colin, this is where we lead us. We'll say this pick. If you get this one wrong, you can, Orrin Horgan over there in Nebraska be mad at you. So I don't know what the line is over at Bettor Edge. I know that the actual line is 13.5. Conlan, 13.5 for Georgia. Conlan, what do you got? This is your pick. This is going to count. This is going to count on your season record.
All right. Well, so you're throwing me here on the spot. Look, I think it's going to be a good game. Honestly, TCU, I thought, was severely undervalued in the semifinal against Michigan. Their offense is legit. Max Duggan is legit. I don't think that highly of Georgia and Stetson Bennett. 29-year-old with an AARP card throwing a bunch of 18, 19-year-old 5-stars. But again, a joke that he was a Heisman finalist. I'm sorry. Good player, not a Heisman finalist. So give me the Horned Frogs getting the points, 13.5. Look, I think it's going to be competitive, but two full scores, not so sure. So like I said, I think Georgia will win, but I think TCU will cover the number.
Well, Conlan, I think it's a good pick. So what do you give us your recap? You got TCU on the cover.
So, TCU on the cover and the Seattle Seahawks -6.5 playing the Los Angeles Rams this week. Win to get it.
So if you get this right, you're up to 14 wins on the season, correct?
If I get both right, 14 wins in the season. Yep.
Colin's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's all you're going to get. So we did nominate Evan Mattel as our conduct rookie of the year. I will say, just as a programming note to our friends out there, we did announce the Sports Law Next Gen Awards and Trailblazer Awards. We're going to announce those, I think right around February 1st, but we have got a ton of nominations. Colin, you did not submit one, but I'm going to give you our sports betting picker of the year. You were the only one that qualified, and give it to you.
All right. Fair enough. I humbly accept the nomination and I
gave it to you.
The winning.
You were nominated. Okay. It's like when you're doing a fantasy football auction draft and someone nominates someone, there's no one else that can outbid them. You just got it. Nomination, you got it.
No,
I was like, so yeah, all good stuff, Conlan. And again, wishing everyone a very happy and healthy 2023, our first episode of the year in the books. Conlan, great job as always for Dan Wallach, myself, Gregg Clifton, our guest today. We will see you next time on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.